Hello friends, welcome to UGC E-PG Pathshala. I am Dr. Lubna Siddiqui, Assistant Professor, Department of Geography, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. Today I am going to discuss about the module Paradigm Shift in Disaster Management from Relief-Centric to Response-Centric, which comes under the paper Disaster Management. The rationale behind this module is the module develops a conceptual understanding of paradigm shift in disaster management and the theoretical background driving the shift in the approach. It further reflects the historical background leading to paradigm shift in global context and the framework supporting the transition. The process of paradigm shift in India is also elaborated along with the objectives and approach. The learning objectives of this module are to analyze the concept of paradigm shift in disaster management and its theoretical underpinnings, to understand the approach of paradigm shift in the global context, to dwell upon the process and implications of paradigm shift in the Indian context. That module is divided into two units, the Unit 1, Paradigm Shift in Disaster Management. Definition. The shift in thinking and focus from a relief-centric approach to a more proactive, holistic and integrated approach for management of disasters through improved disaster preparedness, prevention, mitigation and emergency response is broadly considered as the paradigm shift. The description. Paradigm shift is the change in the way of thinking. The transformation in thinking is fueled by agents of change and occurs through a process of evolution. Historically, disaster management has been a reactive process. As disaster research evolved, it was observed that it is often not possible to stop hazardous occurrences, but preventive measures can be taken to minimize the adverse impacts of the hazards. The term disaster risk reduction is used to mention such measures. The paradigm shift in fact focuses on implementing these risk reduction measures. It is a shift in approach from reactive approach where actions are taken after the disasters occur. For example, providing humanitarian assistance and relief, etc., to proactive approach where holistic integrated planning and management of disaster is innovation, for example, building seismically protected structures, creating legislations, frameworks and guidelines for disaster management, setting up of emergency operating centers and response forces, generating a culture of prevention capacity building, etc. In other words, it aims at addressing the root causes of prospective disasters rather than addressing the stress and shocks arising after disasters. For example, Indonesia is seismically active and prone to earthquakes. Between 2010 and 2016, Indonesia has experienced 11 earthquakes varying in magnitudes from 6.1 to 8.6. To minimize the risk of life losses and injuries, the earthquake preparedness program in schools in Bengkulu, Indonesia was carried out. Based on technical guidance, cost-effective retrofitting of schools was undertaken to make them earthquake resistant. Also, in post-earthquake reconstruction programs, retrofitting was incorporated. Trainings of engineers, contractors, craftsmen and local government officials on earthquake resistance in school building were conducted. Safety drills and information on earthquake preparedness was imparted. Similar initiatives were undertaken in Bandung, Indonesia, where awareness and training programs on earthquake safety were conducted. Case study taken from MFF Regional Training Course 2008. This is a significant departure from the traditional approach where humanitarian assistance and relief is provided only after a disaster takes place to address the stress and shock and aims to minimize disaster risk, addressing the root cause before the disaster strikes. Why paradigm shift is required? Disasters cause massive casualty, affect human beings, impact delivery of services, cause environmental harm, and leave immense economic impacts. Additionally, years of developmental progress get reversed post-disaster occurrences. UNDP report of 2005 states that the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004 set back socio-economic development by 20 years in Maldives. The tsunami occurred only 6 days after Maldives was removed from UN's list of least developed countries. After the tsunami, the tourism sector, which accounts for 70% of the nation's income, got severely affected. The earnings of this sector have helped improve the living standard of the nation and contributed to higher employment rates and enrollment rates in schools. The tsunami reversed this whole process of development of the past 20 years. Similar scenario is observed in the Syrian conflict, where Human Development Index or HDI of Syria has rolled back 35 years, according to UNRWA 2013. Thus, attempts to minimize disaster risk and impacts to alleviate human suffering is not only our moral responsibility, but also it is extremely necessary to maintain the hard-earned developmental progress. In many cases, it is observed that it is far more cost-effective to prevent disasters from occurring beforehand than to recover from them afterwards. Disaster Management Training Program, 1994. It is estimated that every dollar spent on risk reduction saves between $5 and $10 in economic losses resulting from disasters, according to Shorts 2006. Natural hazard events will continue to occur, but steps can be taken to reduce factors that increase risk due to exposure, increase the ability to withstand disasters, and increase the effectiveness of response and recovery. This necessitated the shift from a reactive to a proactive approach. Now, theoretical background. Disaster in a community or society is the outcome of societal implications rather than natural events. Thus, any effort of disaster risk reduction should involve the planning and action by various social units. This conceptual idea that anthropogenic elements play a major role in manifestation of disasters led to the development of the theoretical background based on which the paradigm shift in disaster management has evolved. In 2003, Wisner, Blakely, Cannon, and Davis proposed the PAR and the access model in the book At Risk in 2003, which provided a framework to validate the emerging idea of disasters as a social phenomena. These two models portray disasters as shaped by social processes which involve the interaction of physical events and socioeconomic characteristics of the society. The PAR model looks at the societal vulnerability utilizing a broader spatial and temporal dimension and elaborates the progression of vulnerability. The access model focuses on the processes before and after the environmental or anthropogenic shock and illustrate how these processes shape the future risk. The models are presented. Pressure and release model. Based on the conceptual idea that a disaster is the impact of a natural hazard upon vulnerable people, according to Cannon 1994, the PAR, that is pressure and release model, was proposed. The PAR model considers disaster as the intersection of two opposing forces, the processes which create vulnerability and the hazard or natural process. The opposing forces build pressure, and with increasing pressure building from each side, hazard events turn into disasters. The release idea is incorporated to conceptualize the reduction of disaster, that is, to relieve the pressure. Vulnerability has to be reduced. The image resembles a nutcracker. Figure 2. The progression of vulnerability has 3 distinct stages. The root causes are general processes within the society which are temporarily and spatially distant. They are profoundly bound within the cultural, ideological and social relationships between individuals and communities. The economic, demographic and political factors are most important root causes that give rise to vulnerability. They directly impact the access to resources of individuals or communities. For example, the people who are economically marginal live in risk-prone locations and tend to be less important to people who hold political or economic power. These individuals are by default vulnerable due to lack of political or economic resources and face higher exposure to hazards. The dynamic pressure are processes and activities that translate the effects of root causes both temporarily and spatially into unsafe conditions. Dynamic pressures modify root causes in particular forms which have to be analyzed in relation to the hazards facing the people. It is more specific temporally and spatially than the root causes. For example, rapid unplanned urbanization that results in fewer hospitals or doctors and fewer transportation options to hospitals from highly populous risk-prone areas exacerbate the vulnerability of people. Unsafe conditions are the specific forms in which the vulnerability of a population is expressed in time and space in conjunction with a hazard. For example, the reoccurrence of flood in the region where certain individuals live in houses without flood-proofing measures make them vulnerable. Thus, unsafe conditions are specific temporally and spatially, and micro-mapping of unsafe conditions affecting households, that is ethnically backward, economically repressed, etc., differentially and subsequently groups across households, that is women, children, elderly, disabled, etc., can be done at this level. Based on this model, we can conceptualize the interaction of hazards and vulnerabilities in creating disasters. This focuses more on the elaboration of the progression of vulnerability. The PAR model could be used for a cross-sectional study at any given point in time, but the dynamic nature of the immeasurable vulnerability requires a robust model to attempt any measurement. The access model builds on the robustness and dynamicity of the PAR model and probes the trajectory of vulnerability and vulnerable people once it interacts with hazards and the transition to a disaster. It was taken from At Risk by Wisner, Blackley, Cannon and Davis 2013. Example, landless farm laborers or marginal land holding farmers or different regions relocate to urban areas in lean seasons in search of jobs. They are economically deprived, politically weak and often belong to socially backward communities. They mostly live in slums and dingy buildings which are constructed in unsafe localities or are inhabitable. Example, near railway tracks, on floodplains. These buildings are old and might collapse. In case of an earthquake or flood, these people are affected first due to their high levels of exposure to hazards. These people lack fallback options in case they are affected by a hazard. Thus, they are impacted worst when hazard materializes. The case study of landless squatters in Dhaka can be referred according to Wisner, Blackley, Cannon and Davis 2003. Now, the second model is access model. The model explores how relative resilience of individuals and groups to disasters is determined by differences in access to the economic or political resources. The model provides a broad view of root cause of vulnerability, the cycle of hazards, and provides a framework for looking at livelihoods and vulnerability. It is developed to understand the complex dynamic sets of environmental and social processes that develop from a disaster. The access model fits at the location of the magnifying glass in the PAR model in the wider explanatory framework of the models. The access model explains at a micro level the establishment and trajectory of vulnerability and its variation between individuals and households. It deals with the impact of a disaster as it unfolds the role and agency of people involved, what the outcomes are on them, how they cope, develop recovery strategies, and interact with other actors like humanitarian agencies, community-based bodies, etc. The model consists of 8 boxes of closely related ideas linked by arrows to indicate cause-effect relationship. Hazards 3 have a specific time and space characteristics 4 and result in trigger event. Social relations and structures of domination, figure 1a and 1b, shape household conditions, number 1, which are subject to unsafe condition, number 2. The trigger event impacts on social relations, structures of domination, and overall social protection, box 6. It interacts with households, and while impacting on different households, it follows a process termed transition to disaster, box 6. After the first round of impacts on normal lives, the reaction, coping, interventions, etc., box 7 occur. This phase determines the answer to the question of box 8 to the next disaster and indicates altered conditions of vulnerability. The iteration continues. At Risk by Wisner, Blackley, Cannon and Davis, 2003. Based on the above models, we can identify 2 broad anthropogenic components which can be focused on to maximize the impacts of adverse hazardous events. Pre-existing vulnerability of the society and the quality of reaction to a disaster, coping, adaptation, interventions and other dynamic inputs after the disaster strikes. The proactive approach tries to address these areas to minimize disaster impacts and disaster risk. The approach. The following figure represents the proactive approach in disaster management that also explains the paradigm shift in approach. It focuses on 2 key aspects: reduce the level of susceptibility to hazardous events and build coping capacity, that is fallback mechanisms. Minimize exposure to hazards. To attain the above mentioned objectives, the international, regional and national agencies have developed multiple guidelines and frameworks which are discussed in the next text. Now the second unit is dealing with global initiatives on paradigm shift. National policies and frameworks for disaster management in different nations have shaped up based on the nation's experience with disasters. Different countries have developed diverse sets of institutional agenda and are following different practices. In countries like USA, comprehensive disaster management processes started from as early as 1800 when the division of the federal government was set up to help victims of natural disasters. While for nations like India, the comprehensive framework was set up only in 2005. To bring different initiatives under one umbrella, guide processes and also enable collaboration and cross-learning, a number of international policies and frameworks have emerged from 1990s. The Yokohama Strategy and Plan of Action, that is from 1990 to 1999, can be considered as the first global strategy to address the subject of disaster and disaster risk management. The International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction, that is IDNDR, Program Forum organized in 1999 reflected on the progress in the past decade, and it was observed that despite dedicated efforts, the number and cost of natural disasters continue to rise, according to IDNDR 1999. Following this, the International Strategy for Disaster Reduction was introduced, which proposed institutional mechanism at global, regional and national level for disaster risk reduction. The Hyogo Framework of Action, Building the Resilience of Nations and Communities, which was operational from 2005 to 2015, provided a practically applicable framework for disaster risk reduction. It promoted disaster risk reduction as a policy priority and can be regarded as a stepping stone in disaster risk governance. It also provided critical guidance to disaster risk reduction efforts and has contributed towards achieving the Millennium Development Goals. Following this, many national and regional frameworks were developed. For example, the African Regional Disaster Risk Reduction Framework. The implementation of Hyogo Framework for Action highlighted a number of gaps in addressing the underlying disaster risk factors in the formulation of goals and priorities for action, in the need to foster disaster resilience at all levels, and in ensuring adequate means of implementation according to SFDRR 2015. The Sandel Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction replaced the Hyogo Framework of Action and is currently functional from 2015 to 2030. It builds on the Hyogo Framework to ensure continuity to the work done and also address the gaps in the Hyogo Framework. The Sendai Framework lays a strong emphasis on disaster risk management and defines 7 global targets to operationalize disaster risk management and expects the outcome of reduced disaster risk. The scope of disaster risk reduction was also broadened to focus not only on natural and man-made hazards, but also on hazards related to environmental, technological and biological hazards and risk. The key areas focused currently in the global initiatives for proactive management of disasters are disaster risk reduction, understanding hazard and vulnerability characteristics, prevent creation of new risk, identify, assess and understand existing risk, reduce existing risk, strengthen resilience, develop and implement disaster risk reduction policies, laws, regulations, guidelines, directives and standards, ensure adequate emergency and contingency measures are in place for possible disasters, build back better approach in recovery and reconstruction, provide funding to sustain disaster risk reduction measures, mobilization of risk sensitive investment to avoid the creation of new risk, protection of cultural and natural heritage. Now, risk governance. Strengthening of disaster risk governance, establish adequate institutional and political decision-making structures to govern disaster risk reduction, set of guiding principles and frameworks, accountability for disaster risk management, including primary responsibility of states to prevent and reduce disaster risk, recognition of stakeholders and their roles, multi-sectoral partnerships and collaboration, engagement of institutional community and private agencies to work in disaster risk reduction, strengthening of global cooperation, coordination and partnerships, risk-informed policies and programs, including financial support from international financial institutions, developmental processes, integrate disaster risk reduction measures into development planning. United Nations Development Programme is promoting the goal of sustainable development, and it is argued that disaster awareness considerations should be incorporated into all development programming and planning, both to protect the development process and reduce the risk of wasting scarce development resources, according to Disaster Management Training Program 2006. Along with reduction of exposure and structural mitigation, vulnerability has to be reduced by strategic processes within development, not by the ad hoc application of services that commence after disaster has occurred, according to Lewis 1999. It is to be understood that building to specific standards, disallowing development in hazardous areas, adding gender goals in intervention programs are not likely to have much impact until problems as poverty, land and income distribution and equity issues are resolved, according to Tobin and Montz 1997. With this objective, risk sensitivity in development planning and implementation process is incorporated. Disaster research and awareness. Encouragement to research training and disaster education. Generating public awareness and accountability, availability of information to enable development of informed risk perception, improved role of media and public institutions in generating risk awareness. Now the third unit deals with paradigm shift in the Indian context. The historical trajectory and institutional framework of disaster management in India has been explained in the earlier module. Traditionally, disasters in India have been addressed after the incident has occurred. For instance, the Bhopal gas tragedy in 1984 or the Latur earthquake in 1993. A review of the 5-year plan points the fact that understanding of disasters was to mitigate droughts and floods. Planning Commission 2002. In certain disasters, the failure of governmental mechanism itself led to the emergence of disasters, as evident in the Bengal famine in 1943. The severe damages incurred due to the Orissa super cyclone in 1999 served as a wake-up call for the Indian government. Following that, the high-powered committee set up in 1999 revealed major weaknesses in the system of disaster management in the country. The impacts of Bhuj earthquake in 2001 and the catastrophic devastation caused by the Indian tsunami in 2004 validated the findings of the high-powered committee. Post-tsunami, India declared the National Committee to set up effective institutional mechanism at different administrative levels. Now, National Disaster Management Act 2005. The Government of India took a defining step on 23 December by enacting the Disaster Management Act 2005. The Act envisaged the establishment of dedicated institutional structure for disaster management in India and strengthening disaster risk reduction efforts across the nation. It mandated the formation of the National Disaster Management Authority, that is NDMA, State Disaster Management Authorities, that are SDMAs, and District Disaster Management Authorities, that is DDMAs. It mandated the formation of the National Disaster Management Authority, that is NDMA, State Disaster Management Authorities, SDMAs, and District Disaster Management Authorities, DDMAs. It provided detailed guidelines on the structure, responsibility and functioning of these authorities and incorporated multidisciplinary, integrated and holistic approach in disaster management. It also proposes the development of the National Plan for Disaster Management. For disaster research and training purposes, the establishment of NIDM was envisaged. For a special response to implementing hazard strike or disaster event, National Disaster Response Force was formed. Specific funds like Disaster Response Fund at national, that is National Disaster Response Fund, State, that is State Disaster Response Fund, and District, that is District Disaster Response Fund, Level and Disaster Mitigation Fund at National, that is National Disaster Mitigation Fund, State, that is State Disaster Mitigation Fund, and District, that is District Disaster Mitigation Fund level were set up as part of the Act. This helped in consolidating disaster efforts. These arrangements ushered a paradigm shift from the erstwhile relief-centric response to a proactive prevention, mitigation, and preparedness-driven approach for conserving developmental gains and also to minimize losses of life, livelihoods, and property, according to NPDM 2009. National Policy on Disaster Management 2009. The policy sums up the existing institutional and financial arrangements for addressing disasters in the nation. It also sums up the phase-wise components of disaster management. The objectives of the policy promote a culture of prevention, encourage risk reduction, and aim at mainstreaming disaster management in development processes. National Disaster Management Plan 2015. The plan provides a framework and direction to the government agencies for disaster management and risk reduction. Now, paradigm shift in action. To operationalize the paradigm shift in disaster management, multiple initiatives have been undertaken by the Indian government in association with non-governmental and community-based bodies. The following section mentions a few such initiatives. Promoting a culture of prevention and preparedness. Odisha has a 480-kilometer long coastline stretching over 6 districts of Balsor, Bhadrak, Kendrapara, Jagatsinghpur, Puri, and Ganjam. On an average, in every 5 years, a major cyclone, and almost every year, several cyclones of minor intensity strike the coast, accompanied by high-speed winds, tidal waves, and floods. To deal with the hazard situations, the Indian Red Cross Society, that is IRCS, is managing 75 multi-purpose cyclone shelters constructed in the region to house the affected community during disasters. But in inter-disaster periods, the shelters are used to train communities for preparedness and disaster risk reduction, that is DRR activities. The Red Cross has trained communities in the vicinity of cyclone shelters in first aid, search and rescue, disaster preparedness, management of cyclone shelters, etc. Every cyclone shelter has a task force trained in first aid, search and rescue, and a 30 to 40 community members committee manages these multi-purpose cyclone shelters. Through this initiative, a culture of prevention and preparedness is promoted according to Indian Red Cross Society 2013. Mainstreaming disaster risk reduction in developmental planning. The Integrated Watershed Management Program by the Department of Land Resources, Government of India, aims to restore the ecological balance by harnessing, conserving and developing degraded natural resources such as soil, vegetative cover and water. The outcomes are prevention of soil runoff, regeneration of natural vegetation, rainwater harvesting and recharging of the groundwater table, enabling multi-cropping and the introduction of diverse agro-based activities, according to Department of Land Resources. With the development planning of the watersheds, the hazard of drought is also mitigated. Similarly, Manrega, that is Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, has also been extensively used not only to provide livelihood security but also to create flood mitigation structures like dikes, reservoirs and rejuvenation of canals and natural water systems. Thus, through Manrega, the economic vulnerability of the population is addressed as well as disaster prevention and mitigation measures are getting incorporated. Now, summary. There has been a remarkable shift in the approach, thought and focus from a relief-centric approach to a more proactive, holistic and integrated approach for management of disasters through improved disaster. For example, preparedness, prevention, mitigation and emergency response. It is a change in the way of thought process. It refers to a shift from reactive, that is relief-centric, to proactive approach, that is response-centric. Paradigm shift is required to minimize loss and suffering as also maintain developmental progress. The PAR model considers disaster as the intersection of two opposing forces. Number one, the processes which create vulnerability, and number two, the hazard or natural process. The opposing forces build pressure, and with increasing pressure building from each side, hazard events turn into disasters. The release idea is incorporated to conceptualize the reduction of disaster, that is, to release the pressure, vulnerability has to be reduced. The access model explores how relative resilience of individuals and groups to disasters is determined by differences in access to the economic or political resources. Approach to implement paradigm shift. Reduce the level of susceptibility to hazardous events and build coping capacity, that is fallback mechanism. Minimize exposure to hazards, Sendai framework of disaster risk reduction, provide the global framework for operationalizing the paradigm shift. The National Disaster Management Act 2005, National Policy on Disaster Management 2009 and National Disaster Management Plan 2015 provide the basis for paradigm shift in Indian context. I hope you have understood the concept. See you next time. Thank you.